And that's the thing, right? It was like when you're interviewing, you are pitching yourself. And part of that is like, be memorable, like tell a memorable story, like connect, and for me, when she was talking through like, oh, we were an early stage startup and we had all these problems and we were trying to figure them out. And I was the only product person. It was a memorable story, and the product solutions were interesting and thoughtful and kind of scrappy. And I appreciated that.
You're listening to When You Grow Up, a podcast that matches Johns Hopkins students with the people they dream of being in the future. Tune in to access intimate conversations with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and artists, and hear answers to the questions we all wrestle with. Will I ever feel ready? Can I do it? And most importantly, was it worth it? When You Grow Up is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Hello, my name is Mohamad Elgendi. I'm from Cairo, Egypt, and I'm a master's student studying engineering management at Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Skandar. I'm the director of product for our growth team at Better.com, which is a home ownership and home financing startup based in New York City. And I also hold an MBA from Columbia University and a BA from Georgetown. You're listening to the When You Grow Up podcast.
So I guess to start out, can you tell me your story? How did you come to your position now? What made you interested in the field in the first place?
So it's a funny story. I landed in product management by accident. I was about a year out of college working in a job I didn't love. And a friend of mine from high school reached out and said, hey, I just joined this startup. We raised $10 million in Series A, and we're like hiring and we were looking for great people. Come and talk to my boss and just see if there's a good opportunity for you. So I came in and I talked to his boss. She was one of the founders of the company, and she was charged with building out a product team. And she was like, I don't really know what that means or how to do it, but you seem smart. I'm going to hire you and you can be a product manager. And I was like, cool, that sounds great. But what's a product manager? And that was how I got my job in product management. Total right place, right time, not qualified for the role, didn't know what I was doing, but somebody gave me a chance and kind of changed my life after that. But I learned everything on the job. I had really amazing engineering partners, really amazing peers, and just kind of, this was a long time ago when there weren't as many resources. So just kind of had to make a lot of mistakes. And now, 10 years later, when I look back on like my very first product job, I realized I did everything wrong. But it was a great entry point and a great jumping off point to the world of tech more generally.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing to hear. So, wow, it was pretty much fate then.
I think so, yeah.
So would you say that this experience working in a startup as your first product management role influenced you in your entrepreneurship ventures?
Definitely. Being in that environment, sitting very close to the founders of the company and really seeing kind of what they were working on and whatever, I was excited about that, and probably somewhat like naively optimistic, but it was really motivating and inspiring. And so kind of on the side, I was like tinkering, and my sister and I had a bunch of ideas we were working through, and one thing led to another, and we got to a point where we had an idea that we wanted to see through. And so we decided we were going to go for it. And that's kind of how we started our entrepreneurship journey.
And how was that decision? Like just getting up and saying, I'm going to do this. How was that?
My sister and I called it the burning of the boats, right? Like you cross the river and then you burn the boat so you can't go back. And that was what we referred to it as. And we kept saying to ourselves, like, we'll work on this part-time. And then when it reaches a point where it's either like you're in or you're out, we'll burn the boats. And that's what we did. And so we did get to a point after working on it probably for about a year on the side. We decided it was time to dedicate full time to it. We both quit our jobs and we kind of like poured a bunch of our savings into the business and really tried to get it off the ground and make it work. We learned a lot in the process. We had some success, some good, early signs of growth. Ultimately, we didn't end up kind of, after about 2.5 years, we ended up shutting down the business. But, there were a bunch of reasons. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we took away from it was if you're gonna start this process of entrepreneurship and you're gonna like invest your life into this like idea, which is crazy, right? Like you have to be a little crazy to do something like this. You have to be almost, I call it like delusionally passionate about what you're building. And if you're not, if the product, the service, the app, the company that you're creating isn't in a space that you really care about and really love, it's really hard to sustain all of the ups and downs that come with starting a business. And I think what we realized was we were building something that we thought was interesting, but wasn't really necessarily like an industry that we cared that much about, or even like a problem that we were super passionate about. And so I think that, you know, after a while, like it just wasn't the right fit. And we realized like this wasn't really where we wanted to be spending our time.
Okay, that's super insightful. And honestly, I relate to that so much because like right now I'm working on a startup myself, and like that delusional passion that you just mentioned, that is it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, all you founders have to be that way, right? Because you're going to be criticized a lot. You're going to be told a million times why it's not a good idea, why your business model doesn't work, or why your unit economics don't work, why your value prop sucks, right? And if you can't kind of sustain based on your own belief and passion in what you're doing, it's just really hard to keep going.
When it comes to, so how was transitioning from being a full-time entrepreneur into joining the workforce again?
Oh boy. You know, it was hard only because even though we knew it was like time to wrap up the business, even though we knew like it wasn't the right thing for us and all that, like it was hard, like emotionally, to shut down our business, right? We had spent 2.5 years putting our blood, sweat, and tears, literally some tears, into this business, including and our money. And you know, it felt like failure. And it so then you're like, well, I've failed, and then also now I have to go out and like try to convince somebody to hire me, and my story to tell is, well, I spent 2.5 years working on this thing that I just shut down. So it's like it was hard, I think, emotionally. It's a little bit of like a you know, you have like a little bit of a bruised ego about it. And I found that I was really like hyper aware of all of my flaws at that point. Like, well, if only I knew how to do this thing better, maybe this would have been more successful. Or if only I was more focused on the financials, maybe this would have been more successful. Whatever it is, like you kind of are hyper aware of like all the things you don't know in that moment. And so part of going out and getting a full-time job and convincing somebody else to hire you is confidence and being very clear on like, here's what I have to offer. Like, here's my experience. Here's what I can do for your business. And it's really hard to tell that story when you're like, I've just failed. So I think that part was really hard. Thankfully, I joined an early stage startup. It was like 10 of us. And, you know, we were like, at one point, we were actually working out of the founder's house, like literally his home, in like a one room of his home, because like we couldn't afford to pay for the office anymore. So it felt very similar in some ways to the entrepreneurship journey. And so I think that was like a good way to ease back in. But obviously it definitely took some like adjusting and then some additional like confidence boosting to get back to a place where I felt like, okay, I can deliver value here.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is essentially, so there's a lot of blessings to entrepreneurship. There's also some curses, and being aware of your weaknesses is one of the glaring curses of entrepreneurship, because when you're doing it yourself, no one's there to support. You realize like, okay, I need to get better at this.
Yeah, definitely. And then you kind of you have to figure out how to get better at it. And that's not always clear or easy.
Can you tell me about your daily task? Like, what's a day in the life of Sabrina?
Yeah. So I'll tell you about a day in the life of Sabrina currently, but it is potentially a little bit different from other product roles that I've had in the past. So as I mentioned, I'm the director of product for the growth team for Better.com. Better is a homeownership and home financing startup based in New York. We aim to kind of rethink the entire journey of homeownership. We've seen tremendous growth over the last few years. I've been with the company 2 years now. And so that's basically where I spend all my time, is really thinking about the company's growth. How do we continue to accelerate that? how do we find new opportunities for growth? How do we think about improving what exists already to increase conversion? Where do we go out and acquire new customers? When we launch new products, how do we take them to market? Things like that. On a day-to-day basis. So I spend the majority of my day in meetings. Part of that is because I'm in a management role. So a lot of it is like, logistics and kind of figuring out who's working on what and which strategy are we pursuing and what are we spending our time on, and solving problems of like, who owns this piece of the puzzle, and are we building the right flows, and how did this experiment that we just launched perform, and what are their numbers today, and what happened in the macro economy that affects mortgage rates, right? So there's like any sort of things that I have to communicate with other people on any given day. I think when I get into the more like the deeper, like actual like product work, a lot of it, so growth product management is a little bit different than other types of product management, in that we are really ultimately focused on some like core business metrics. So acquisition, conversion, retention, activation, different things like that. And so what we look to do is figure out, let's look at the funnel, all of these different points for somebody to go through for us to actually like win a customer, and how do we optimize, how do we drive value? And so we run a lot of experiments. If you ever participated in a science fair in grade school, this will sound really familiar, but basically we come up with hypotheses. If we build X, we think we can improve conversion by this much percent because customers will not get confused and drop off on the screen, whatever the hypothesis is that is attached to some sort of guiding metric. And then we run a test. We launch some new feature or change to 50% of the population, and we compare the two groups. And at the end of it, we see which one was successful and by how much. And then, we report out our findings. And if it was successful, we roll it out to 100%. And we just do that over and over again to find ways to optimize and grow and improve. And so it's very much a collaborative role. We work across teams. We work with engineering, with design, with our marketing partners and our acquisition team, and our sometimes our sales team as well. So it's a super cross-functional role. And at any given point, I am in a meeting with people with 6 different roles in the company, trying to figure out what's the next best thing to deliver impact.
Okay. Wow, that was a lot. So as part of your role, do you interface with the customer directly?
So not as much currently as a manager, but I think when you're an individual contributor PM, I think if you're not interfacing with the customer, you're probably not building the right products. I believe really strongly that good PMs are very much in touch with the customers. They are doing customer interviews. Even if you have a UX research team, as we do at Better, it doesn't mean that product managers should be like sitting back and waiting for the research syntheses, right? Like a good PM is there with the researchers, helping to inform what are we trying to learn, what questions are we asking. They want to be in those interviews. They want to ask their own questions, because until you actually start having those conversations with customers, it's very hard to understand what to build, or like what the pain points are, what problems you're trying to solve, what the mindset is of a customer, especially when they're buying a home, which is the single largest transaction that most people make in their lifetime. And that's incredibly intense. And I think sometimes there's a tendency as a product manager to like fall back on your own experience. And that's a bad thing, because you're not every user and you're not the customer. And if you rely too much on your gut and intuition, you're kind of ignoring the data and the research that's out there. And so I do encourage my team to go out and conduct interviews, talk to customers, put something in front of people and see what response you get. I think it's a really critical skill to build as a product manager.
Okay, so what skill do you think was the most essential to get you to where you are today?
Problem solving. I think that's the most critical skill for a PM, and that's what I look for when I interview people. Can you come up with creative ways to solve problems that are not obvious to everybody, right? And I think it's one that you can develop over time, but I also think there's an element to just like being able to look at something and solve it. And one of the interesting things about this too is, based on the level of complexity of your solution, I can kind of tell how senior or junior you are. And the funny part is, more senior people often have the simplest solutions, And more junior people often have the most complex solutions. And I think that's one of the things you really learn after being in product for a while is, there's often a tendency early on in your career to like build something brand new to solve a problem. And as you get a bit more senior, you're like, oh, if I just, move this thing around, or if I just change this one thing, I can solve the same problem in 1/10 of the time. And so that's something I look for a lot, and I try to screen for when I interview candidates.
What advice would you give to someone who's applying to be a product manager?
So product management is an interesting field, right? Because it's very difficult to just have no product background, apply to a job as a product manager, and get that role, which means it's very unclear. Like, if you're interested in product management, how do you break into it? And I get this question all the time. And as I mentioned to you, my background and how I got into it, it's not a very helpful answer to most people because, like I said, I got into it accidentally. But what I tell people is I have seen people do it very deliberately. And there's like a couple of different paths in. My favorite path into product management is I like to see people internally transfer from other teams in the company. And I have personally hired people onto my team from other roles within the org. So somebody who initially was working in our operations team, and they come over and they become a product manager. The reason I like that is they have some sort of like underlying knowledge of the business or the customer or some problem that exists that is very useful for the product organization. And then it's really just about learning like the product process and how to think through building product strategy, how to work with engineering, how to work with design, all of that. But a lot of times people from like our sales org or operations org, for example, they're on the phone with our customers every single day. And so they deeply understand the customer journey and the customer pain points, and they have deep empathy for our users. And so that is a really good quality as well for a product manager, and something I look for. I think there are other kind of transfer roles that are often really good, right? A lot of people come from engineering backgrounds, and they're more likely maybe to be a technical product manager or a platform product manager. There are people who come from marketing or product marketing roles as well. They're often good growth product managers. So there's like a couple different ways in from that sense. And I think that those tend to be generally more successful than trying to get hired directly into product without a product background. I will say that there are a handful of companies that will kind of hire associate PMs, just very early career people and train them entirely, but they're kind of rare. So you do have to kind of hunt for those jobs. They're not super easy to find, especially if you're coming out of, undergrad or maybe an MBA program. The only other company I know of that will hire people with non-product backgrounds into product jobs, I think, is actually Amazon. And I know they're a pretty big recruiter, particularly in MBA programs. And so I always tell people, if you're thinking about getting an MBA because you want to get into product management, like your best bet is to get a job at Amazon when you graduate. That's like a very good way into product if you have had some career experience, but not in the tech world.
Makes sense. Okay. And in terms of interviews, what was the most impressive thing you've seen at an interview?
Oh, good question. So there's someone on my team that I hired about a year ago, and she's actually one of the best hires I've ever made. And she came from a pretty like early stage startup where she was like the only product person. And she walked through a couple of like very key like problems that she had solved, and she gave a presentation on some projects she had worked on, and it was like very kind of interesting solutions to problems that I wouldn't have guessed or wouldn't have thought of. And I just found that the way that she presented and laid them out was super thoughtful. It was very clear. It was like, this is the problem we solved. This is what we needed to achieve. Like, this is what we tried out. Here was the impact. It's not like, it's not rocket science. It's fairly straightforward, but it was just a really compelling storytelling exercise. And I think storytelling is another really important skill for product managers. And so the fact that she was able to like tell that story in this like presentation, and I was like so invested in like the fate of the business from it. That was like a really, it kind of, I still remember it. Like I still remember the product, and I've probably seen 100 of these presentations over the last 2 years, and I very deeply remember her presentation. And so I think just having a really compelling story and showing, growth of the product, growth of the area that you care about, that's always a really good way to stand out in an interview.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, because the way I'm conceptualizing this in my mind is essentially when you're trying to pitch a product, you want to show a use case. And essentially she was the product and her startup was the use case.
For sure. And that's the thing, right? It's like when you're interviewing, you are pitching yourself. And part of that is like, be memorable, like tell a memorable story, like connect, and for me, when she was talking through like, oh, we were an early stage startup and we had all these problems and we were trying to figure them out, and I was the only product person. It was a memorable story, and the product solutions were interesting and thoughtful and kind of scrappy. And I appreciated that.
Okay. Makes sense. So what about some no-nos in the interview process? Like what are some things that you've seen or heard about that you're like, Mohamad, never do this?
That's a good one. I think one big one is like, you have to be kind of careful when you talk about your previous employer, and particularly like if you maybe had a bad experience. I think, I recognize that not everyone has a great job, and sometimes you have a bad manager, you come from a company with toxic culture and whatever. But you have to kind of be deliberate in how you tell that story. And I think sometimes it can come across really angry or bitter, and it kind of just like sets like a weird tone for the interview. So, if you've left because you hated your past job and you're asked, why are you leaving, or something like that, I would just kind of, be a little bit thoughtful in how you explain why it wasn't a good fit for you. I would try not to badmouth anyone from your previous company specifically. It seems obvious, but I have definitely heard that in interviews.
Okay, and what about for fresh grads?
So it's interesting. It's always kind of challenging when you hire fresh grads, because like I even am like, well, what do I ask, right? Like there is no work experience. I think what we're looking for with fresh grads is, do you have a history, even if you haven't had like a full-time job, do you have a history of working hard and delivering impact? That might be through a club you were part of, a volunteer organization that you had, some maybe a part-time job, a summer camp, right? Like there's all sorts of like life activities or things that you've maybe been a part of as an undergrad that you can point to that show hard work, leadership, impact, all of that. And that's something we care about a lot. I think also for an undergrad, passion and excitement about the opportunity and the business is really critical. The questions that you ask of the interviewer are almost more important than the questions that the interviewer asks you, because it shows how much research you've done. Like, do you understand the role here? Do you understand the business? Have you researched the company? Do you know what the industry looks like? And so I think doing some homework there and being really ultra prepared for the interview with some background knowledge of the business helps signal your passion and your excitement for the role, which is something we care about a lot, particularly for entry-level people.
Okay, so let's talk about work-life balance. So how do you balance your personal life or your hobbies with your very demanding work?
We try to be thoughtful about work-life balance. The way that I coach my team is we demand a lot, right? We ask for a lot, but that means that so when you're here, we demand a lot. When you're working, we demand a lot. But that means that I want you to take vacation, and I want you to take a break, and I want you to sign off at night. I don't think people do their best work when they're overworked or burnt out. And so when you're on, I want you on and in it 100% and delivering, like firing on all cylinders. But then I want you to disconnect, and I want you to truly disconnect, because everyone needs that refresher. Everyone needs to take a break sometimes. When you take a break, you come back refreshed. Your mind is clearer. You have better ideas. You're more motivated. So we really do try to find that balance. I don't know if we always do. I don't know if sometimes it's maybe more work than somebody thought it would be. I like to think we're pretty accommodating and flexible, but we're pre-IPO company. Like the stakes are high, and it is there's a lot happening at any given moment. We move quickly, and we do expect a lot from our team.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so what is the most surprising thing you found upon entering your current company?
I wasn't really sure when I got this job if I wanted it, right? I was like, mortgages, like that sounds pretty boring. I'm not sure how I feel about it. Like, I'll try it out, and if I hate it, I'll leave in 3 months. And then I kind of just got really into it, and I think I think that's been true for like a lot of people, right? You get a lot of people who come from all sorts of backgrounds, not necessarily from anything related to home financing or real estate, and you kind of get really obsessed with what it is that we're building and how we're changing the industry, and the work that we're doing to move things forward. And I didn't realize I could be so excited about this product that I thought was so boring when I first started.
I'm so glad that you love what you do. Like that just gives such positive energy, you know?
It is
Okay,
nice. I will say, when you like what you're doing, it doesn't feel that much like work.
okay. So when it comes to networking, do you have any advice about networking to students who are interested in just getting into the PM industry?
Networking. This was like my least favorite part of business school. It's like they tell you have to network. The reality is, like, it doesn't hurt, right? Does it always help? No, but it kind of never hurts to get out there and meet people and things like that. I think one thing that I didn't really understand the value of until later in my career was like, networking isn't for just when you're looking for a job, and it's not just for when you're already like graduated and out in the job market. Like networking starts in high school, right? I mean, and remember, I told you I got my first job in product because of a friend from high school who thought I was worth reaching out to. And so the value of like building those relationships from early on, so your high school friends, your college friends, your grad school friends, those are all people who are potential opportunities someday. And it sounds like weird to call your friends like potential opportunities, but it's not so much about like, only talking to people you think might one day be able to do something for you, but it is about developing a good reputation. It's about being somebody that people think of when they're thinking of an opportunity or a problem to solve or advice, and I think like building relationships, I think I prefer to call it that, right? Building relationships is more important than networking. And I think it's really a wise thing to always focus on building relationships with your peers, with people in your industry. It's not always going to lead to a job, but it's never going to hurt you, right? Like it's always good to have those contacts and be able to reach out when you have a question, or, you're starting a business and you want to talk to people, or you're looking for a job.
Is there anything that you wanted me to ask that I didn't yet?
Well, something I like to ask myself all the time, and I ask my peers as well, is what do you actually want to be when you grow up, right? And it's funny because I'm doing this great job that I really love, right? But I've still got plenty of years of career left ahead of me. And when I think about like when I was little and I asked myself, what do you want to be when you grow up? That answer changed like a whole bunch of times. And I, especially as I got older, it became less and less clear what I actually wanted to be when I grew up. And I'm kind of happy about that, because if I would have been really strict about like, this is what I want to be when I grow up, when I was in high school, let's say, I never would have ended up in product, because this field didn't really exist, right? And so I think sometimes about the future, and I'm like, well, what will exist? What careers will exist in 10 years? What careers will exist in 15 years? And so I think about that a lot. But where I have landed, I guess, for right now is, so I really enjoy the work that I'm doing. I really enjoy being in the startup world. I enjoy being in tech and product, helping businesses grow. The kind of thing I've always like thought of, especially when I was in business school, eventually I want to be able to invest, right? And when I was in business school, I did my internship with a VC firm in New York, and spent actually some time in the Bay Area as well. And so going forward, I think my longer term plans are to actually kind of move to that side of the table and say, once I'm done sort of operating, and once I've gotten a lot of really good experience under my belt from early stage companies through IPO and kind of beyond, I want to go out and enable other people to pursue their dreams and really help fund other entrepreneurs. And, I think I'll have like a much better understanding of like what success looks like and how to help people achieve that. So I think that's the other question I'd want you to ask is, what do you actually want to be when you grow up?
As a co-founder myself, I can't tell you how much that means to me. Like, I really appreciate that vision, and we need more people like that just in the world. So thank you. So like to close this off, do you have any advice for students who are graduating in May?
Here's one that I wish somebody had told me when I was graduating. You have to be your biggest champion. No one is going to automatically just recognize your greatness and give you things, right? And I think a lot of people have a tendency to say like, oh, I'll let the work speak for itself. I'm going to do great work and I'm going to be recognized and praised, and I'm going to receive promotions and opportunities because of it. And the reality is like, that doesn't really always happen. And so I think it's really important for people entering the workforce to know that it's important to promote yourself and to self-advocate and to find people who will be your champion as well. But like always kind of understand the value you bring, and don't be afraid to like explain that. Don't be afraid to tell your manager, I think I'm ready for a promotion. Don't be afraid to ask for a raise. Don't be afraid to negotiate a job offer. You never know until you ask, right? And I think it's really important. And too many people don't realize that until much later in their careers. And then it's much harder to build that muscle.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, well, including myself, who need to hear that advice. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And honestly, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation. And like, hopefully our audience are going to enjoy it too, because there's just so much insight in it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. This was really fun.
You've been listening to the When You Grow Up podcast. If you liked this podcast and got value out of it, the best thing you can do is share it with your friends. And if you're interested in having a conversation with someone who has your dream career, shoot us an email at growup@jhu.edu. That's growup@jhu.edu. We'd like to give a special thanks to our student host and guest professional. This program is produced by Aaliyah Poonawalla and Casey Miller. Our team writer is Casey Miller. The podcast was edited by Thomas Nishimoto and Josh Felton. Tessa McKenzie is our relationship manager, and Ben Stevens is our project manager. When You Grow Up is presented by Higher Hopkins and Hopkins Connect. Thank you so much for listening.